Tonight, Nigeria faces its worst food crisis, affecting more than 4 million people. Half of those affected are young children. And Canada's immigration plan does not protect French, says Premier François Legault. He says Quebec will not allow a huge rise in immigration. From the vaults, Zahira Lynn Eppard explains how to develop a child's life skills in an interview by Sister Saamiyah Syed.
Well, children can pick up, and they learn to pick up, especially before they develop language skills.
Assalamu alaikum and good evening. This is Muslim News Canada on Muslim Network TV. I'm Catherine Bullock, sitting in for Saamiyah Syed, who is on a well-deserved vacation. The United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator for Nigeria says the long-standing armed conflicts in northeast Nigeria are stopping people from cultivating crops in their farmlands. The coordinator says over 2 million people are displaced as a result of the conflict. They are no longer able to farm and produce their own food. The UN official says the number of displaced people taking refuge in the states of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe increases every day. He has emphasized that these individuals face difficulties accessing humanitarian aid. He says a staggering 4.3 million people are facing severe food insecurity issues this year. He says half of that population is young children. The UN official points out that if more is not done, 700,000 may face severe acute malnutrition. Long-standing internal armed conflicts, climate change, and the Russia-Ukraine war have made food insecurity in Nigeria worsen. This year's food crisis is also worse than last year's. Children are dying because they are not getting enough nutrition. The official is calling for an urgent mobilization of $391 million, most of which will be spent on food aid. Quebec's political class is objecting to Canada's plan to welcome 500,000 permanent immigrants every year until 2025. Quebec's legislators say the change will reduce Quebec's influence in Canada and make it harder to protect French. Quebec's legislative members recently adopted a motion calling Canada's immigration plan incompatible with the protection of French in Quebec. The motion affirms Quebec's right to make its own choices regarding immigration matters. Earlier this week, Quebec Premier François Legault said the province will not accept a huge rise in immigration because of limited housing and educational opportunities. Legault said Quebec is different from the rest of North America. He says it is important to protect French. He emphasized that his priority is that newcomers all speak French. Please stay tuned. We will be back after a short break.
Now, every week, Muslim Home releases a parenting newsletter on a new topic. One of their latest issues discusses developing a child's life skill. Joining us now is Sister Zahira Lynn Eppard, the Director of Education of Sound Vision, to share more on the week's issue. Welcome, Sister Zahira. It's a pleasure to have you on the show again.
Always a pleasure to meet with you, Sister Saamiyah.
Likewise. Sister Zahira, as I mentioned before, the issue of Muslim Home that we are discussing today is regarding developing life skills. One important part of this is developing interpersonal skills. So can you tell me why focus on interpersonal skills for this time's issue?
So I don't think there could be an issue more important than communication to either adults or children. And children learn very organically how to communicate and how to interact with all kinds of people in their families, strangers. And they do that largely from the modeling of their parents at a young age. And so by focusing some attention on helping parents understand how they can help children develop in these areas, then they can focus on things like learning to be an active listener, how to give full attention to someone, how to provide feedback to someone in a conversation, and how to give, our undivided attention to someone so that we suggest by our behavior and our words that what they're saying is important to us. Again, these are life skills that can be beneficial at various times, from childhood to adulthood.
Mhm. Now, I know in your newsletter, you delve into these tips a lot more in more detail and give almost a step-by-step guide. But if you can share about 2 skills and how parents and adults can encourage the development of these skills, can you share how they would go about this?
So, I mean, one interesting area is to talk to children, and we have to use age appropriate language for sure, but to talk to children about 2 different types of communication. One is verbal and one is nonverbal communication. So, by our words, we may be making a statement, but by our actions could be speaking in exactly an opposite direction. And so children can pick up, and they learn to pick up, especially before they develop language skills, on nonverbal communication. And so by enhancing their understanding of that, it helps them at a young age and at a later age and into their work lives. I think another thing to think about is to think about how we give feedback during a conversation to show that we're listening. And sometimes what we do is when we are talking, we might nod our head. That just means I agree with you. I understand what you're saying, and I want to hear you say more. Another area is by making sure that children are patient in conversation, that they're not trying to talk over one another, and that they're developing those skills of actively listening. And these things are things that just enhance relationships. They happen whether we're conscious of them or not. This is just about talking about really improving effective communication.
Mhm. On the topic of active listening, one of the things I picked up in the week's issue is that when having these conversations with children, we have to validate their feelings. Can you expand on just what that means?
Well, it's really important for us to give children the tools they need to express themselves and to identify feelings. Feelings sometimes, especially in different cultures, are not always associated with positive things. Sometimes we discourage children from expressing negative feelings or feelings of frustration. We teach them actually to suppress feelings, and that's not okay. It's not okay for young kids, it's not okay for adults. But one of the things I liked about what we talked about in the issue was the use of what we call a feelings wheel. That is making sure that you have your own way of expressing feelings outside of just a very basic list, not just anger, fear, happiness, but things like boredom, things like frustration, things like annoyed, things like disappointed, things like feeling maybe alienated. Those kinds of things mean different things, and by helping children pinpoint their feelings, we can help identify the source of maybe frustrations or anger and teach them how to then resolve those problems.
Mhm. And on the topic of communication and verbal expression, something that I couldn't help but wonder to myself when reading this is that culturally, there is some kind of expectation that kids should not express themselves as much. It's seen almost as dissidence or talking back. And I know many parents do it because they were expected to be the same, but why should we move away from this kind of parenting, and how do we do that?
Oh, that's a big question. We have a short amount of time. I think that this is why we like to provide articles on a wide variety of topics from a wide variety of experts, about parenting and especially about communication. I think that it's convenient for us to often just ask children to be silent, and to expect that silence is obedience. That's really not the way the Prophet ﷺ showed us an example in parenting, or an example in the way he taught adults about the beauty of this religion. It's really important that people get an opportunity to ask questions, to be heard, to express their concerns or doubts. And children fall into that category too. And when we don't engage them this way, they fill in the gaps themselves. It might suggest by our suppressing a feeling that feeling isn't valid. It's not okay for them to be angry. It's not okay for them to be frustrated. And this can suppress things like learning disabilities. It can also avoid addressing trauma. And trauma doesn't go away just because we don't talk about it. It manifests itself, and it often hurts us physically and emotionally. And that is the source of many adults' problems, also, when it's not dealt with at an early age.
And linking back to what you said earlier, the way to overcome this then is to try out some of those communication strategies, active listening,
Yes.
and the like.
Right. And it doesn't have to be necessarily that we're always so serious. We're not talking about that. We're talking about just developing skills and giving parents and children more tools in their toolbox. One of the articles that we wrote about, one of our writers, Melissa Barreto, talked about how she likes using actually games to teach her children about communication. She listed 5 games. Some of them you can play in the car, like 20 questions. Others you might need to play where you have tools to work with, like blind drawing. These enhance the way you listen. They enhance the way you communicate verbally, and they help you, even with this blind drawing example, in directing somebody how to do something, starting to really think about communication in a different manner. And that can be fun. We're not talking about just serious lecturing here. We're talking about modeling life skills and enhancing the way you go about teaching your children just about how to negotiate life. That's what life skills are.
My personal favorite entry for this issue was the one on home economics and its connection to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Can you please share more on that connection?
Sure. Aisha, radiallahu anha, was one of the people that provided the most hadiths about the way the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam lived his life, especially at home. And what she said about his home life was that he concentrated on serving his family, and then he was attentive when prayer came in. Now, what did serving his family mean? In his case, it meant being attentive to his wives, his children, sometimes sewing and mending his own clothes, also helping with cooking, chores around the house, entertaining guests, being considerate of the people around him. And home economics sometimes gets neatly coined to be something that just is something women need to think about: sewing, cooking, childcare. It's way more than that. It's about how we live and maintain our homes. It's about cleanliness, hygiene. It's about negotiating public space, transportation, whether it's our own cars or needing to use public transportation. It's about meal planning and cooking, learning about our bodies, what they need in terms of nutrition. There's an entire huge area of study, and our article on that actually talked about a curriculum that's used in that area, which identified 7 different major areas that kids can learn more about at a young age. And when boys and girls learn those things at a young age, it's far easier for them to be independent in their own lives and to serve their own families. This is an Islamic way of life, really.
And it comes all back to the idea that it's developing your life skills, and it's an ongoing process starting from childhood and beyond. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sister Dahira. As always, it was a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you too. Always love to be with you.
You are watching Canadian Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. That's it from our Toronto studios tonight. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more Canadian Muslim content. Stay safe, and until next time.